Simbi stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of a glass mansion in the Hamptons, one hand pressed against the cool glass, the other resting on her seventh-month belly, as if shielding the child from the house itself. 28 years old, 7 months pregnant, and already so hollow it felt like her heartbeat echoed in the empty space where her voice used to be. Beyond the glass, Long Island Sound stretched into darkness. Yacht lights, moving silhouettes, a horizon that promised escape to those who could afford to run. But Simbi had stopped running 3 years ago. She'd learned the rules. Don't contradict David in front of investors. Don't answer calls after 9 p.m. Don't ask where the bruises come from. Just cover them with foundation expensive enough to match the lie. Tonight, the lie was holding. La Mer concealer hid the shadow blooming across her cheekbone, the one David had painted there 2 nights ago when she'd suggested postponing the product launch. He'd smiled when he did it. That was the part that made her hands shake now. The sound of tires on gravel made her stomach clench. David's Bentley. Early. Her phone buzzed. A message from Peter. "Still good, sis?" She typed back quickly, fingers trembling. "Fine, don't come, I mean it." Because if her brothers ever found out what fine really looked like, David's empire wouldn't just fall, it would burn. And Simbi had spent 3 years making sure Peter and Paul stayed in their legitimate world, far from the darkness they'd promised to leave behind. She couldn't let them come back, not even for her. The front door opened. David's footsteps on Carrara marble, slow, deliberate, the sound of a man who owned everything he walked on, including her. Simbi's reflection in the car window looked like someone else's life. The Valentino dress David had chosen clung to her frame, empire waisted to accommodate the baby, midnight blue to match his tie. He'd laid it out on the bed that morning with the same precision he used for everything. Phone calls timed to the minute, meals plated like gallery installations, a wife who smiled on command. The venue was the Plaza Hotel ballroom, transformed into a temple of chrome and glass for the launch of David's new AI-driven investment platform. Journalists circled like sharks, their cameras flashing against the chandeliers. David's hand found the small of her back, fingers pressing just hard enough to remind her of the rules. Smile, wave, say nothing interesting. She lasted 90 minutes. The journalist was young, eager, a woman from TechCrunch who'd cornered Simbi near the champagne fountain. "Mrs. Andrew, what's it like being married to one of Silicon Valley's most disruptive CEOs? Do you ever contribute ideas to his projects?" It was a soft question, a kind question. Simbi should have deflected with the practiced humility David had scripted for her. "Oh, I just support his vision." Instead, exhaustion made her honest. "Actually, I used to work in product strategy before we married. I think democratizing access to investment tools could really address wealth inequality in—" David's hand closed around her elbow. "My wife is being modest." His smile was camera-ready. His grip was a vice. "She's too busy preparing for motherhood to worry about cap tables anymore. Excuse us." He guided her toward the terrace with the easy authority of a man escorting his property. The Manhattan skyline stretched before them, a million lights promising freedom to everyone but her. The music from inside became muffled, distant. "What did I tell you about interviews?" His voice was soft. That was always worse than yelling. "She asked me a direct question. I was just—" "You were showing off." He stepped closer, "making me look like I married you for your MBA instead of—" His eyes dropped to her belly, then back to her face. "You embarrassed me, Simbi." "David, please, not here, not tonight." "You're right, not here." He smoothed his tie, adjusted his Patek Philippe. "We'll discuss it at home." The words landed like a sentencing. Simbi's throat closed. She thought of her phone in her Judith Lieber clutch, Peter's last message still glowing on the screen. "Call if you need us." But calling them would mean admitting what David was, what she'd become. So she followed him back inside, back into the lights and the applause, back into the glass cage that everyone mistook for a palace. And when the photographer from Forbes asked them to pose together, Cindy smiled like she'd been taught. Like a woman who had everything. Like a woman who wasn't already counting the hours until the glass would shatter. The drive back to the Hamptons took 43 minutes. Simbi counted every one of them in the suffocating silence of the Bentley's leather interior. David's jaw was set, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel now. That was worse than the white knuckles. When he was calm, he'd already made his decision. He'd already planned what came next. She tried once. "David, I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking." "No." His voice was pleasant, almost friendly. "You weren't, but that's going to change tonight." The house loomed ahead, all glass and steel and architectural awards, perched on 3 acres of manicured silence. The staff had been dismissed hours ago, David's standing order on gala nights. He liked privacy for what he called their discussions. Simbi had learned that the bigger the house, the more soundproof the isolation. He opened her door himself, offered his hand like a gentleman. She took it because refusing would only make it worse. They walked through the grand entrance together, past the Damien Hirst in the hallway, past the Italian marble that cost more per square foot than most people's mortgages. She made it to the living room before his hand fisted in her hair. 7 years. The pleasant voice was gone. 7 years I've turned you from a nobody with an MBA into Mrs. David Andrew. I've dressed you in Chanel. I've put you in Forbes. I've made you somebody. He jerked her head back, forcing her to meet his eyes. "And you repay me by making me look weak in front of Mark Andreessen and the entire tech press?" "I didn't mean to." The first blow caught her across the mouth, splitting her lip. The Cartier love bracelet on her wrist, the one he'd screwed on 2 years ago, romantic and permanent, bit into her skin as she tried to shield her face. "You don't mean anything." His fist connected with her ribs, calculated, precise. David had played lacrosse at Princeton. He knew exactly how much force to use. "You're an accessory, a vessel. You speak when I tell you to speak." Simbi's knees hit the Restoration Hardware rug. She curled around her belly, around the 7-month flutter of life that was the only thing still hers. "Please, the baby. David, stop." "My heir." His Berluti Oxford caught her in the spine. "My legacy. My redemption story for the IPO roadshow." Another kick. "Do you know what you've cost me tonight?" Goldman was watching, Sequoia was watching, and my wife decided to play feminist in front of TechCrunch. "I didn't mean to." The pain stopped being specific and became everything, white hot and spreading, turning her bones to glass. She tasted blood, felt warmth spreading between her legs. Wrong, too early, the baby. When her vision started to tunnel, she heard David's breathing change, not from exertion, from satisfaction, the sound of a man who'd completed a task. Then footsteps, measured, purposeful. The sound of glass shattering in another room, the kitchen window, the scrape of furniture overturning. David's own knuckles, which he was methodically scraping against the brick fireplace. The baccarat vase that had been wedding gift, smashed on the floor near her head. He was staging it. Through the fog, she heard his voice on the phone, panicked, perfect. 911? Yes, please, there's been a home invasion. My wife is pregnant. They hurt her. God, there's so much blood. Please hurry. We're at 47 Meadow Lane. He knelt beside her, cradling her head with the tenderness that had fooled her 3 years ago. His lips brushed her ear. "Tell them what I tell them, or your brothers find you in pieces. Nod if you understand." She managed the smallest movement. Yes, always yes. Good girl. The sirens started as distant wails, growing closer. David's tears were real when the paramedics burst through the door. He'd always been good at crying on command. Simbi watched him from somewhere far away as they loaded her onto the gurney, as he held her hand and sobbed about the monsters who'd done this. The ambulance ride was fragments, fluorescent lights streaking past, a paramedic's voice, BP dropping, we're losing her, the oxygen mask, the IV, the monitor showing her baby's heartbeat, fading, struggling, desperate.
At Lenox Hill Hospital, they rushed her past triage, past the ER, straight to the ICU. Code blue, emergency C-section on standby. David in the hallway, giving his statement to two NYPD detectives, his voice breaking at the right moments. In the ICU, machines breathed for her, kept her heart beating, monitored the failing rhythm of her child. And in Chicago, at 2:47 a.m., Peter's phone began to ring. The darkness that answered would terrify a city.
Peter was in a late-night meeting at his Chicago office when his phone lit up with a New York number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it. The waterfront development deal with the pension fund was at a critical point, and legitimate business required legitimate focus. That was the agreement he and Paul had made 3 years ago. Leave the old life behind, build something clean. Keep Simbi safe from the stain of what they used to be. But something made him answer. "Mr. Okonkwo, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from Lenox Hill Hospital. I'm calling about your sister, Simbi Andrew. She's been admitted to our ICU following a violent assault. Her condition is critical." The room stopped. The lawyers across the table kept talking about zoning permits and tax incentives, but Peter couldn't hear them anymore. Only the doctor's voice, clinical and careful, explaining traumatic injuries, internal bleeding, emergency procedures to save the baby. Her husband reported it as a home invasion, Dr. Chan continued, but there are some inconsistencies we're obligated to note. The injury patterns. I'm on my way. Peter ended the call and stood, his chair scraping against Italian tile. The lawyers looked up, startled by the change in his face. The boardroom businessman was gone. What remained was something older, colder, carved from the South Side streets where he and Paul had learned that mercy was for people who could afford it. "Gentlemen, we're done here. Sign the papers or don't. I don't give a fuck anymore." He called Paul before he hit the elevator. His twin answered on the first ring. They'd always had that sense, that animal awareness when something was wrong. "It's Simbi." Peter's voice was flat, controlled, the tone that used to make grown men nervous in the old days. New York, Lenox Hill, ICU, her husband saying home invasion. Silence. Then Paul's breathing changed. The tech billionaire? David Andrew? That's what the doctor called him. "We told her," Paul's voice carried, 3 years of suppressed knowing. "We fucking told her that man had dead eyes, but she wanted normal, she wanted clean." Peter was already in his car, the Aston Martin he'd bought because legitimate businessmen drove legitimate cars. "Call everyone. I don't care where they are or what they're doing. I want them in New York by morning." "Everyone?" Paul's question wasn't a question, it was confirmation. Everyone who remembers what we used to be. The twins had spent 3 years building a legitimate empire. Real estate development, private equity, municipal contracts. They'd donated to children's hospitals and sat on nonprofit boards. They'd worn suits to city council meetings and shaken hands with aldermen. They'd convinced themselves that the past could stay buried if they just kept building over it. But the past wasn't dead. It had just been waiting for permission to breathe. Peter's next call was to Marcus Williams, who ran a security consulting firm in Detroit, but used to run the West Side when they were all young and hungry. Then Dmitry Volkov in Brighton Beach, who'd gone legit in import-export, but still had the kind of connections that made customs agents look the other way. Then Teresa Ruiz in Miami, then Jackson Chen in LA, then a dozen others whose business cards said one thing, but whose history said another. By the time Peter's plane left O'Hare at 4 a.m., the machine was already moving. Phone trees activated, old debts called in. Men and women who'd put away their violence like archived files, now pulling them back out and remembering exactly how everything worked. Paul met him at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey at dawn. They didn't hug, didn't speak, just looked at each other with the understanding of twins who'd survived their father's fists, their mother's overdose, the foster system, the streets, the gang wars, and finally the decision to become something their sister could be proud of. That decision had been a mistake. "How do you want to do this?" Paul asked as they climbed into the waiting Escalade.
bulletproof glass and reinforced doors, driven by Tommy Chen, who used to drive very different vehicles for very different purposes. Peter stared out at the Manhattan skyline, the city waking up to another day of business and ambition and the lie that money could buy safety. "Carefully," he said. "We find out what really happened, and if that motherfucker touched our sister," his jaw tightened, "then we remind this city why people used to be afraid of our name." The Escalade merged into morning traffic, just another black SUV in a city full of them. But the men inside weren't just another anything. They were the Okonkwo brothers, and they'd come home.
Lenox Hill Hospital at 6 a.m. was all fluorescent efficiency and the antiseptic smell of controlled emergencies. Peter and Paul walked through the main entrance in matching Tom Ford suits, looking like venture capitalists coming to check on an investment. The receptionist smiled at them. Handsome men, clearly money, probably hedge fund types visiting a colleague. She stopped smiling when she saw their eyes. "Simbi Andrew," Peter said. Not asked, said. "ICU. We're her brothers." The woman's fingers trembled slightly on her keyboard. "4th floor, but visiting hours don't start until—" "4th floor." Paul's voice was soft, polite, absolutely terrifying in its quietness. "Thank you." They took the elevator in silence. Tommy Chen and 3 others stayed in the lobby, santering casually across the seating area like men waiting for nothing in particular, but their positions covered every exit, every corridor, every angle. Old habits. The ICU was hushed, all beeping monitors and whispered conversations between nurses. A doctor, Dr. Chen, her badge red, met them at the nurses' station. Her face was professionally compassionate, but her eyes held something else: suspicion, concern. "Mr. Okonkwo? Both of you?" She glanced between the identical twins. "Simbi is stable but critical. The injuries were severe: blunt force trauma to the torso, facial fractures, internal bleeding. We had to perform an emergency C-section. The baby, a girl, is in the NICU. Touch and go, but fighting." Peter's hands, resting at his sides, curled into fists. Paul's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only signs. "Her husband is in the private waiting room," Dr. Chen continued, her voice dropping. "He's been here all night, very distraught." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The police are investigating the reported home invasion, but I have to tell you, the injury patterns are inconsistent with a struggle or defensive wounds. They're more consistent with—" "Where is he?" Peter asked. Dr. Chan pointed to a door at the end of the hall. "But first, would you like to see your sister?" They would. They did. And the sight of Simbi, machines breathing for her, tubes running from her arms, her face swollen and discolored beneath the bandages, turned something in both brothers from anger into something colder, more permanent, more patient. Paul leaned close to her ear and whispered in Igbo, the language of their childhood, the language their mother used to use for prayers. "We're here now, Simbi. Rest. We'll handle everything." Then they walked to the private waiting room. David Andrew looked up when they entered. He'd been crying. His eyes were red. His $5,000 shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled in that artful way that spoke of genuine distress. He stood, extending a hand. "I must be Peter and Paul, Simbi's brothers. I'm so glad you're here. This has been—" His voice broke convincingly. "It's been a nightmare. These animals breaking into our home, hurting her." Neither brother took his hand. They just looked at him, silent, still. 2 men who'd learned a long time ago that violence had a language of its own, and sometimes the most terrifying thing you could do was absolutely nothing. David's hand slowly lowered. His smile faltered. I've given everything to the police. Surveillance footage, timeline, description of the vehicle I saw leaving." "Surveillance footage," Peter repeated, his voice empty of inflection. "Yes, from the exterior cameras. Unfortunately, the interior system was disabled during the break-in." "Convenient." "I'm sorry?" David's tone sharpened slightly, a flash of the man who ran billion-dollar board meetings.
My wife was nearly killed. My child is fighting for her life. I've been cooperating fully with—" "Her knuckles," Peter interrupted, still in that flat, dead voice. "Our sister, Onday. Did you notice her knuckles?" David blinked. What? "No defensive wounds," Paul continued as if Peter hadn't spoken. "No skin under her knee fingernails. No scratches on her palms. Our sister is a fighter, Mr. Andrew. Has been since she was 6 years old. Raised in foster care. Survived things that would break most people." He tilted his head slightly. "Strange that she wouldn't fight back against home invaders. Unless she couldn't. Unless she knew fighting would make it worse." The room's temperature seemed to drop. David's face cycled through confusion, indignation, and something else, just for a second, that looked like fear. "I don't know what you're suggesting, but—" "We're not suggesting anything," Peter said. He stepped closer, and David instinctively stepped back. "We're just here for our sister, to make sure she's safe, to make sure nothing else bad happens to her." Another step. "To make sure the people responsible for her pain understand something very clearly." David's back hit the wall. Peter and Paul stood in front of him, two mirrors of quiet, contained fury. "We know what you did," Paul whispered. Then they walked out, leaving David Andrew alone in that private waiting room, his reflection staring back at him in the dark window, finally understanding that the cage he'd built for Simbi had just become his own.
David Andrew returned to his Hamptons estate at noon, flanked by 2 private security guards from Sentinel Protection, the best money could buy, or so their marketing promised. The house was still a crime scene, yellow tape across the shattered kitchen window, evidence markers on the marble where they'd found Simbi. He'd convinced the detectives he needed to retrieve some documents. In truth, he needed to think. The brothers had rattled him. That silence, those dead eyes, like looking into something that didn't negotiate or compromise or respond to the logic of money and influence that had governed David's entire adult life. He called Marcus Reeves, his head of security, 42 years old, former Secret Service, 230 pounds of tactical training and situational awareness. Marcus had worked for senators and CEOs, had prevented kidnapping attempts in Bogota and assassination plots in Riyadh. If anyone could handle 2 angry siblings playing tough, it was Marcus. The call went to voicemail. David tried again. Voicemail. He checked the security app on his phone. Marcus's location showed him at the Midtown office, probably in a meeting. David left a message. "Call me immediately. We have a situation." By 3 p.m., Marcus still hadn't called back. David tried the office directly. Marcus's assistant, Jennifer, sounded confused. "Mr. Andrew, Marcus left this morning to meet with you. He said you'd requested a private security assessment at the Hamptons property." Ice formed in David's stomach. "I didn't request anything." "Oh, well, he left around 7, said he'd be there by 9. I haven't heard from him since." David ended the call and immediately dialed the NYPD detective assigned to Simbi's case. "Detective Morrison, David Andrew, I think something may have happened to my head of security. He's missing." Morrison's tone was professional, but wary. The brothers' hospital visit had clearly made its way through official channels. "Missing how, Mr. Andrew?" "Since this morning. He was supposed to meet me and never arrived." "That's barely 8 hours, not usually enough time to file a missing persons report for an adult, but given the circumstances with your wife, I'll make some calls." They found Marcus at 6 p.m., exactly 12 hours after he'd left his office. He was sitting in his own car in the parking garage beneath David's Manhattan office building, in the CEO's reserved spot. The door was unlocked, the keys were in the ignition. Marcus was in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, both hands on the steering wheel in perfect 10-2 position. David got the call from Morrison. "Mr. Andrew, we found Marcus Reeves. He's alive, but you need to get to Weill Cornell Medical Center right now." David arrived to find Morrison waiting outside the ER, his expression grim. "What happened to him?" David demanded. "He won't say. Can't say, really. They dislocated both his shoulders, broke 3 fingers on his right hand, and—" Morrison paused. "They didn't touch his face. That was deliberate. They wanted him to be able to speak. Jesus Christ, did he tell you who did this? He's asking for you, only you. They led David to a private room where Marcus sat on the examination table, both arms in slings, his right hand heavily bandaged. The man who'd protected Fortune 500 executives looked diminished, hollowed out. Not from the physical pain, David could see that in his eyes, but from something else, terror. Marcus, who did this to you? Marcus's voice came out hoarse, like he'd been screaming. They were waiting in my car. 2 men. I didn't even see them until... He stopped, swallowed. They knew everything, David. My routine, my home address, my ex-wife's name, my daughter's school. They knew things that aren't in any database.
What did they want? They asked me questions. About the house, about the security system, about the night Simbi was hurt. Marcus's good hand trembled. They asked if I'd helped you stage the scene. David's blood turned cold. What did you tell them? The truth, that I wasn't there, that I don't know anything. Marcus looked up, and David saw something he'd never seen in the former Secret Service agent's eyes before. Genuine fear. They believed me. That's the only reason I'm alive. They said they were being merciful because I hadn't helped you. Did they say anything else? Marcus nodded slowly. One of them, the one who broke my fingers, he leaned in close when they were done. He said, "Tell David Andrew that this is a courtesy. Tell him the brothers are home. Tell him that every person who works for him, every person who protects him, every person who helps him, we know who they are. And if he runs, if he hides, if he tries anything clever, we'll visit every single one of them, not to kill them, just to deliver messages." The room spun slightly. David gripped the wall for support. That's a threat. That's conspiracy. I can have them arrested. With what evidence? Marcus's laugh was bitter. They wore gloves, left no DNA. The security cameras in the garage mysteriously malfunctioned for exactly the time they were there. And David, he leaned forward, wincing, I don't think the police can help you. These aren't gangbangers or desperate criminals. These are professionals. Organized, connected, the kind of people who make problems disappear. David's phone buzzed. An unknown number. Text message. Just 4 words. The brothers are home. Below it, a photo. David's Hamptons estate, taken from an angle that should have been impossible, from inside his bedroom. His Patek Philippe on the nightstand, his reading glasses, his laptop open to his encrypted offshore accounts. They'd been in his house, while he was at the hospital, while the police were processing the scene. They'd walked through his life like ghosts. Morrison's phone rang. He answered, listened, his face darkening. I see. Yes, I'll tell him. He ended the call and looked at David. That was the tech team, the surveillance footage from your estate, the exterior cameras. Someone accessed the system remotely this morning and corrupted the files. All of them. There's no footage from the night of the assault. David's carefully constructed alibi, his perfectly staged crime scene, all of it was collapsing. And somewhere in the city, 2 brothers were watching, waiting, tightening a noose he couldn't see but could definitely feel. The message was clear. David Andrews' empire, built on control and precision and the illusion of untouchability, was about to learn what happened when you hurt someone whose family didn't believe in police or courts or the civilized rules David had always used to his advantage. The brothers were home, and they played by different rules entirely. The War Room was a penthouse suite at the Mandarin Oriental, paid for in cash, registered under a shell company that didn't exist on paper. Peter and Paul sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by people who officially didn't work together. Dmitry Volkov, with his Brighton Beach networks that stretched from Moscow to Manhattan. Teresa Ruiz, whose Miami connections could move anything across any border. Marcus Williams, who knew every corrupt official in 3 states, and a half-dozen others whose resumes were impressive lies, covering decades of very specific expertise. David Andrew, Peter said, sliding a folder across the table. Net worth $4.2 billion, majority of it liquid, diversified across offshore accounts in the Caymans, Switzerland, and Singapore. He's smart, nothing directly traceable. Nothing's untraceable, Dmitry said in his heavy accent, already typing on his laptop. Just costs more to trace.
Paul pulled up a projection on the wall, a web of David's financial architecture, compiled over the past 18 hours by people who specialized in finding what wasn't meant to be found. His weakness is pride. He keeps everything under his personal control. No partners, no board oversight worth mentioning. Every account, every shell company, every investment vehicle, it all flows through him. Which means, Teresa added, lighting a cigarette despite the no-smoking policy, when he falls, everything falls with him. Peter nodded. Dmitri, I need you on the financial infrastructure. Start with the Cayman accounts. I want them frozen by midnight. Frozen requires bank cooperation, Dmitri pointed out. Very expensive cooperation. Money's not an issue. Paul slid a piece of paper across the table. A routing number, an account balance with more zeros than most people would see in a lifetime. The brothers' legitimate empire had been profitable, but their old empire, the one they'd never quite liquidated, just put to sleep, had been even more so. Whatever it costs. Dmitri smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Considered it done. Peter continued. David has security details, drivers, personal assistants. I want them all to receive offers they can't refuse. Better pay, better conditions, jobs that start immediately. Anyone who stays loyal to him after today does so knowing we gave them a chance to walk away. Marcus nodded. Half will take the money, the other half will be too scared not to. And the press? Paul asked, looking at Teresa. She exhaled smoke, grinning. Already handled. I have a friend at the SEC, loosely defined as friend, who's very interested in David's last 3 acquisitions. Turns out there might be some irregularities, insider trading, market manipulation, falsified documents, the kind of irregularities that make prosecutors salivate. How long until it leaks? Wall Street Journal has it now. They're confirming sources. 48 hours, maybe less. Peter stood, walking to the window overlooking Central Park. Below, the city moved through its evening routines, people going home to families, to safety, to lives that didn't include brothers in hospital beds breathing through tubes. I want more than leaks. I want documents, emails, proof. I want every journalist in this city to have enough material to bury him for years. His servers are secure, one of the tech specialists, a woman named Angela Chen, said from the corner. Military-grade encryption, isolated networks, biometric access. Nothing's secure if you have the right access point, Paul replied. David has an executive assistant, Rachel Morrison, 14 months on the job, underpaid, overworked, and, according to her social media, pretty resentful about missing her daughter's dance recitals.
Angela smiled. Social engineering. Classic. Give me her name, her coffee order, and 6 hours. By midnight, the first domino fell. David's primary Cayman account, the one holding $800 million in liquid assets, was frozen pending an investigation into money laundering. The bank's compliance officer, who'd been financially persuaded to expedite the inquiry, cited suspicious transaction patterns and regulatory concerns. By 2 a.m., 3 more accounts followed. Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg, each one locked down, inaccessible, trapped in bureaucratic red tape that would take months to untangle, even with an army of lawyers. By dawn, David's executive assistant, after a chance encounter with a sympathetic stranger at her daughter's school who understood the struggle of working for demanding bosses, had inadvertently provided her login credentials. Angela Chen was inside David's server within an hour, downloading 7 years of emails, financial records, and private communications. The Wall Street Journal published at 6 a.m. The headline was devastating. Tech mogul David Andrew under SEC investigation for securities fraud. The article cited anonymous sources, leaked documents, and a pattern of illegal trades dating back 5 years. By 7 a.m., the story had been picked up by Bloomberg, CNBC, and the Financial Times. David's phone started ringing at 6:03 a.m., investors demanding explanations, board members calling emergency meetings, his lawyer saying they needed to talk immediately. By 8 a.m., his stock portfolio had lost 12% of its value. By 9 a.m., 2 venture capital firms had pulled funding from his latest acquisition. By 10 a.m., 3 corporate sponsors had terminated their endorsement deals.
Peter and Paul watched it all from their penthouse suite, monitors displaying news coverage, financial tickers, social media trends. David Andrews' carefully constructed empire was crumbling in real time, broadcast across every platform that mattered. "It's not enough," Peter said quietly. Paul looked at his twin. "It's just the beginning." Because freezing accounts and leaking scandals was just the opening move. The brothers weren't trying to hurt David financially, they were trying to strip him of the one thing he valued more than money: power, control, the illusion that he was untouchable. They wanted him to feel what Simbi had felt in that Hamptons mansion, trapped, helpless, watching everything he'd built become a cage with no escape. And they were just getting started.
David's hands shook as he threw clothes into a Louis Vuitton duffel, the first time in his life he'd packed for himself. His penthouse apartment felt like a trap now, every window a potential vantage point, every shadow a threat. The news was playing on mute, his face on CNBC, stock tickers hemorrhaging value, talking heads dissecting his empire's collapse with the gleeful precision of vultures. He'd made the decision at 11 a.m. Run, regroup, fly to the Caymans or Singapore, somewhere his frozen accounts could be unfrozen with the right lawyers and the right bribes. He still had cash, $2 million in a safe deposit box at Chase, enough to disappear and rebuild. His driver was gone, quit via text message at 9 a.m., no explanation. His security team had evaporated overnight. Even his lawyer had stopped returning calls after the SEC investigation went public. So David did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He drove himself, taking the Bentley from the underground garage, heading toward Teterboro Airport, where his Gulfstream G650 was supposedly fueled and ready. He made it 3 blocks before he saw them. 2 black Escalades idling at the intersection, no plates, tinted windows. They didn't follow him. They didn't need to. They just sat there, watching, a reminder that someone knew exactly where he was going. David's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. David Andrew. The voice was calm, professional, not Peter or Paul, someone who worked for them. "Your flight plan to Georgetown has been canceled. Your pilot received a better offer this morning. Early retirement, full pension. He accepted." "Who the fuck is this?" "The brothers wanted you to know. There's nowhere to go, but you're welcome to keep trying. It's entertaining." The line went dead. David's jaw clenched. Fine, no private jet. He'd go commercial. He changed direction, heading toward JFK, already pulling up first-class tickets to London on his phone. American Airlines, departing at 3 p.m. He could make it. The Bentley's tire blew out on the Van Wyck Expressway. Not a puncture, an explosion. The car swerved, David wrestling with the wheel as he pulled onto the shoulder. He sat there, breathing hard, and watched in the rearview mirror as a black sedan pulled up behind him. 2 men in suits got out, walked to his window, and stood there waiting. David didn't roll it down. One of them held up a phone, showing David a text message. "Wrong direction. Turn around." They walked back to their car and waited. David sat there for 10 minutes considering his options. Call the police and say what? That men in suits were following him? That his tire had mysteriously blown out? He had no proof of anything, no evidence, just paranoia that was starting to feel justified. He called a car service. The dispatcher was apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Andrew, but we're unable to provide service to you at this time." Click. He tried Uber. His account had been suspended. Unusual activity. He tried Lyft. Same message. Finally, David got out of the Bentley and flagged down a yellow cab. The driver, a tired-looking man in his 60s, pulled over. David climbed in. Manhattan Docks, the marina at West 79th Street. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You sure, buddy? Just drive." They made it halfway there before the driver's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his face went pale. "Sorry, man. I gotta let you out." "What? No, I'll pay you double." "Get out, please." The driver's voice was shaking.
I got grandkids. I can't just get out. David found himself standing on a Manhattan street corner at 2 p.m., watching the cab speed away. Around him, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Tourists, business people, delivery trucks, normal life. But for David, every person in a dark suit looked like a threat. Every car that slowed down felt like surveillance. He walked to the marina. Took him 40 minutes in Ferragamo loafers that weren't meant for walking. His yacht, a 60-foot Sunseeker named Kingmaker, was docked in its usual slip, white and gleaming in the afternoon sun. The captain was waiting on deck. Not his captain, a different man, younger with the cold eyes David was starting to recognize. "Mr. Andrew, your vessel's been acquired. New ownership as of this morning. Cash sale, all legal. You'll want to speak with your accountant about the paperwork." "That's my fucking boat." "Was your boat." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The brothers send their regards. They suggest you head back to your penthouse. Stay where they can see you. Makes everyone's job easier." David stood on the dock, the Hudson River stretching before him, freedom so close he could smell the salt air. But the message was clear. He couldn't fly out, couldn't drive out, couldn't sail out. Every exit was watched, blocked, controlled by an organization that moved through the city like water through cracks. His phone buzzed. Another text from an unknown number. This time, a photo, David himself, taken from across the marina right now, standing on the dock. Below it, "Stop running, it's embarrassing." And below that, "The brothers will see you soon." David's empire had been built on control, controlling markets, controlling narratives, controlling his wife. But now he was learning what it felt like to be the one controlled, the one trapped, the one watching all his exits close while someone else held all the keys. He turned and walked back toward Manhattan, past the black Escalades that had followed him all day, past the men in suits who didn't even bother hiding anymore. They just watched him go, patient and certain, because they knew what David was only beginning to understand. There was no escape. There was only the reckoning.
David returned to his penthouse at dusk, defeated and exhausted. The doorman, new, someone he'd never seen before, nodded politely and said nothing about the fact that David's shirt was soaked with sweat, his $5,000 loafers scuffed from miles of walking. The elevator rose 43 floors in silence. David leaned against the mirrored wall and barely recognized his own reflection. 2 days ago, he'd been untouchable. Now he looked hunted. The penthouse door was unlocked. He'd locked it. He always locked it. The biometric scanner, the 6-digit code, the redundant security that cost him $30,000 to install, all of it meaningless when the people coming for you knew how to make locks irrelevant. Peter and Paul sat in his living room like they owned it. Peter in the Eames chair that had cost more than most people's cars, Paul on the couch, both of them relaxed and patient. Between them, on the coffee table, was a stack of documents and a single pen. "How did you—" David started. "Your security system?" Paul gestured casually toward the control panel on the wall, now dark and useless. "Excellent technology. Top of the line. Unfortunately, the company that installed it has very reasonable employees, people who understand that loyalty has a price point." David's hand moved toward his phone. Peter's voice stopped him. "Your phone won't work. We've jammed the signals in this building. No calls in or out, no witnesses, just us." "What do you want?" "Everything," Peter said simply. He stood, walked to the window overlooking Central Park, the city lights spreading like a circuit board below. "We want you to understand what you took from our sister, what you took from us." "I didn't— It was a home invasion." Paul moved faster than David expected, crossing the room and gripping David's throat, not choking, just holding, just making a point. "Don't." His voice was a whisper. "Don't insult us by lying. We know what you did. We've known since the hospital. The doctors know. The nurses know. Everyone knows except the police report you paid for." He released David, who stumbled back, gasping. "Sit."
commanded Peter, gesturing to the chair across from them. David sat. Paul picked up the documents from the coffee table. These are transfer agreements. Your accounts, what's left of them, go into a trust for Simbi and her daughter. Your properties, the Hamptons estate, this penthouse, the Aspen Lodge, all transferred to Simbi's name. Your stock portfolios, your venture capital stakes, your equity positions liquidated and placed in an account you'll never touch. That's everything. That's your entire life's work, Peter finished. Yes, everything you built while using our sister as a punching bag. Everything you accumulated while making her feel small. It all goes to her now. I'll fight this in court. With what lawyers, Paul asked, the ones who stopped returning your calls? With what money, the accounts that are frozen? With what reputation? The one currently being destroyed on every news channel in America. He pulled out a remote and turned on the wall-mounted television. CNN was showing David's corporate headquarters, federal agents walking out with boxes of documents. The Chiron read, FBI raids tech mogul's offices in expanding fraud investigation. That's impossible, David whispered. That's what happens, Peter said, when you forget that some people have reach that goes beyond corporate boardrooms. Our family, our real family, the one you never bothered to investigate, has connections in places you never imagined. The kind of connections that can make prosecutors very interested in cases they might have overlooked. Paul set a pen on top of the documents. Sign.
And if I don't? The brothers looked at each other, then back at David. Peter's smile was cold. Then we stop being merciful. We stop targeting your assets and start targeting you. And trust us, David, you don't want to know what that looks like. David's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. He thought about fighting, about refusing, about making some stand for principle or pride. But he'd spent the day learning that his power was an illusion, that his control was borrowed, that everything he'd built could be dismantled by people who understood violence in ways his Ivy League education had never taught him. He signed, page after page. His empire, his identity, his entire existence transferred to the woman he tried to erase. Paul's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and something shifted in his expression. Relief, joy, the first human emotion David had seen from either brother. She's awake, Paul said quietly to Peter. Peter closed his eyes briefly, exhaled. Then he looked at David with something that might have been pity but was closer to contempt. Simbi just opened her eyes at Lenox Hill. The doctors say she's going to survive. So is her daughter. That's good, David managed. I'm glad she's... You don't get to be glad, Peter interrupted. You don't get to feel anything about her anymore. You're nothing to her now, less than nothing. They stood to leave. At the door, Paul turned back. The FBI will be here in an hour. We made sure of that. You'll be arrested for securities fraud, conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges that will keep you busy for the next decade. You'll lose in court. We've made sure of that, too. And when you're sitting in whatever minimum security facility they send white-collar criminals to, you'll have plenty of time to think about the woman you underestimated. Her brothers, David said, finally understanding. You're not just... What are you? Peter smiled. We're the people who raised Simbi when no one else would. We're the people who built an empire so she could have a legitimate life. We're the people who walked away from violence so she wouldn't have to know what we were capable of. He paused. But we're also the people who will burn down this entire city if someone hurts our family. You forgot to ask which brothers you were dealing with, David. That was your fatal mistake. They left him there, alone in his penthouse that no longer belonged to him, watching the news coverage of his downfall, knowing that somewhere across the city, Simbi was waking up to a world where he no longer had power over her. The king had fallen, and the brothers had made sure he'd never rise again. Simbi woke fully 3 days later in a place that smelled like lavender and ocean salt instead of antiseptic and fear. The villa was somewhere in the Hamptons, Not David's glass monstrosity, but a different estate, older and warmer, with stone walls thick enough to stop bullets and security that moved like shadows through manicured gardens. Peter had bought it under a shell company 2 years ago, a contingency plan for emergencies he'd hoped would never come. Her daughter, 3 pounds, 4 ounces, and furious about being born early, slept in a bassinet beside the bed, monitored by a private neonatal nurse who'd been thoroughly vetted and generously paid. Through the window, Simbi could see Paul on the terrace, phone pressed to his ear, conducting business with the same intensity he'd once used for very different purposes. Peter sat in the chair beside her bed, looking older than he had 3 years ago, tired but present. How long? Simbi's voice was hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed yesterday. Since the attack, 9 days. Since we got here, 3. Peter poured water from a crystal pitcher, held the glass while she drank. You've been in and out. The doctors say you'll need months of physical therapy, but you'll recover. The baby, your daughter, she's a fighter, like her mother. Simbi's hand moved to her stomach, finding it flat and empty. The panic must have shown on her face because Peter quickly added, She's right here, right next to you. She's perfect, Simbi. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that work overtime. Tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Peter held her hand while she cried, saying nothing, just being there, the way he'd been there when they were kids in foster care, when the world was cruel and all they had was each other. David? She finally asked. In a cell at MDC Brooklyn, federal custody, no bail, flight risk. Peter's voice was flat, factual. He's been charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and about 15 other crimes that will keep him occupied for the foreseeable future. His trial is set for next year. His lawyers have already started negotiating a plea deal. You did this. It wasn't a question. Peter didn't pretend otherwise. We did what needed to be done, what we should have done 3 years ago when you married him and we saw who he really was. He leaned forward. Simbi, we respected your choice to live a clean life, to marry someone legitimate, to distance yourself from what Paul and I used to be. But that respect almost got you killed. We won't make that mistake again. I didn't want you to go back to... We never really left, Paul said from the doorway. He walked in, sat on the edge of the bed. We just pretended we did. Built legitimate businesses, wore expensive suits, donated to the right charities, but the connections, the network, the people who remember what the Okonkwo name used to mean, that never went away. We just kept it quiet, for you. Simbi looked between her brothers, these men who'd raised her in apartments with broken locks and empty refrigerators, who'd made sure she got to college while they built an empire in the shadows, who'd walked away from violence so she could walk towards something better. What happens now? She asked. Peter pulled out a folder, set it on the bed. Everything David owned now belongs to you. The Hamptons estate, we're selling it. You'll never have to see it again. This villa, though, it's yours. His investment portfolios, his stock options, his offshore accounts that we've unfrozen, all transferred to a trust in your name and your daughter's name. You are worth approximately $1.8 billion, Simbi. More than enough to never depend on anyone again. I don't want his money.
Then give it away, Paul said. Start a foundation, fund domestic violence shelters, help other women escape men like David. But take it first. Take everything he tried to use to control you and turn it into something that gives other people freedom. Simbi looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully despite being born into chaos. She thought about the woman she'd been 9 days ago, silent, careful, always calculating how to minimize the damage. That woman had died on the Carrara marble of David's foyer. And David? She asked. In prison. You said he's in a cell. Peter's smile was cold. MDC Brooklyn is an interesting place. Overcrowded, understaffed, full of people who don't particularly like white-collar criminals who abuse their wives. We've made sure the right people know exactly what David did to you. And we've made sure the guards who might be inclined to make his stay comfortable have better reasons to look the other way. You're going to have him killed. No, Paul said firmly.
We're going to let him live for decades in a place where his money means nothing, his name means nothing, and every single day he'll remember that he had everything and lost it because he underestimated the woman he married." He paused. Death would be mercy. We're not feeling merciful. 3 months later, Simbi stood on the terrace of her villa, her daughter, named Grace after their mother, asleep against her chest in a wrap carrier. The physical therapy had worked. The scars were fading. The nightmares still came, but less frequently now. Below, in the garden, Peter and Paul were meeting with associates, some legitimate businessmen, some whose businesses existed in grayer areas. The brothers had stopped pretending. The Okonkwo name meant something again in New York, whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike. Not with fear, exactly, but with respect. The kind of respect that came from knowing certain families protected their own with absolute ruthlessness. David's trial had been brief. 23 years in federal prison, no parole eligibility for 15. The judge had been particularly harsh after sealed testimony from Simbi's doctors had been entered into evidence. Testimony that detailed injuries inconsistent with any home invasion, that told the real story of what happened that night. The city had watched it all unfold. Tech mogul brought down by his own crimes, his pregnant wife barely surviving. But those who paid attention, those who understood how power really worked, they saw something else. They saw what happened when you touched someone protected by the Okonkwo brothers. Simbi's phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "I'm sorry. Please tell them I'm sorry." David, somehow still able to make calls from prison, still trying to reach her. She deleted it without responding. He was a ghost now, a memory, a chapter closed. Grace stirred against her chest, making the small sounds that meant she'd be hungry soon. Simbi looked out at the ocean, at the horizon that used to represent escape, but now represented possibility. She was free. Her daughter was safe. And her brothers, the ones who'd walked through darkness so she could live in light, were making sure no one would ever hurt either of them again. The Okonkwo dynasty had returned, and this time they weren't hiding.
Moral lessons from this story. 1. Silence protects the abuser, not the victim. Simbi's attempt to hide the truth from her brothers nearly cost her everything. Abuse thrives in secrecy. When we protect abusers by staying silent, whether out of shame, fear, or misplaced loyalty, we become accomplices to our own destruction. Real strength isn't suffering alone. It's having the courage to let the people who love you help carry the burden. 2. No amount of wealth can buy character. David had billions, but no integrity. He confused control with love, possession with partnership. Money can build empires, but it cannot build a soul. True power lies not in what you can take from others, but in what you give and how you treat those who cannot defend themselves. 3. Family isn't just blood, it's who shows up when it matters. Peter and Paul didn't abandon their sister when she married into a world that rejected their past. They transformed themselves, built legitimate lives, and waited in the shadows, ready. Real family doesn't judge your choices. They protect you from the consequences of the bad ones. 4. The abuser's greatest miscalculation is underestimating their victim. David saw Simbi as property, never recognizing that she carried a name with weight, a history with teeth, and brothers who would move heaven and earth to protect her. Abusers operate on the assumption that their victims are alone and powerless. They forget that every person has a story, connections, and people who love them enough to become dangerous. 5. Justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes the system fails. Sometimes courtrooms protect the powerful and money buys silence. But there's an older kind of justice, the kind that comes from family, from community, from people who remember that before laws and lawyers, there was simply right and wrong. This story reminds us that accountability finds its way, one way or another. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think twice about the masks people wear and the battles people fight in silence, do these 3 things.
Subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories that matter, stories about survival, justice, and the complicated truths of human nature. Like this video if you believe that everyone deserves safety, dignity, and a family that will fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's someone in a difficult situation who needs to know they're not alone. Maybe it's someone who needs to understand what abuse really looks like behind closed doors. Maybe it's someone who needs to be reminded that silence is never the answer. Your engagement helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Don't just watch, participate in spreading messages that could save lives. Subscribe, like, share, because stories have power. And sometimes that power is the difference between staying trapped and finding freedom.